Hey folks, I'm brownbear. Today I'll be doing a retrospective on Age of Empires III. This is the second in a 4-part series of videos I'll be doing on the Age of Empires series. Last time I covered Age of Mythology, this time I'll be covering Age of Empires III, and in the next two videos I'll cover Age of Empires I and Age of Empires II. If you're not familiar with me, I'm a former top competitive player in both Age of Mythology and Age of Empires III, going by the handle Parfait. I'd like to start just by apologizing for the long delay between videos. This video, and probably all future videos, will be different in the sense that they'll be scripted a lot more loosely. I apologize in advance for any lack of organization. Unfortunately, I just don't have the time to write super polished long-form scripts anymore. On the plus side, my commentary style will be a bit more natural because I won't be reading from a very dense text, so hopefully that makes up for it. Age of Empires III was developed by Ensemble Studios and released in 2005 for the PC platform. Trying to think about what this game is, I would probably say that there are a couple of high-level schools of thought. Starting out, you would probably consider the most straightforward approach, which is to say that the game is an incremental successor to both Age of Mythology and Age of Empires II. From Age of Mythology, we got smaller maps, better early game scouting, a simplified economy, and stronger early game defense. From Age of Empires II, we got an emphasis on sprawl in base building, a large diversity in civilizations, and the general aesthetic and time period. Now, I think that this is definitely an interesting perspective, and from time to time I'll definitely refer back to it. But for me personally, I look at this game through a different lens. I think of it as a kind of philosophical successor to a long-standing design trend in the broader Age series. Starting with the Conqueror's expansion to Age of Empires II, you repeatedly see gameplay changes, what Ensemble probably would have described as gameplay innovations, that ultimately simplify and streamline core game mechanics. Automatic farm reseeding, auto-queue, the removal of gather points, and the looser and easier economy of the first Age all felt like attempts to mainstreamify the core mechanics of Age. I'll pull up a quote here that I often bring up when discussing the design trajectory of the Age series. Here's Bruce Shelley, one of the top game designers at Ensemble, discussing how the series had developed over the past several years. The biggest changes to me over the entire series are changes in graphics, nice 2D to stunning 3D, the gradual reduction in micromanagement, the increasing sophistication in the single-player campaigns, and the continual innovation in gameplay features. The part about micromanagement is really interesting to me. It's just one sentence in a much larger interview, but I think it's fundamental to understanding how Age of Empires III works. When I talk about micromanagement, what I want you to think about is the complementary notion of micro-decision-making. Micromanagement focuses on the mechanical burden of executing small, sometimes tedious actions. Micro-decision-making emphasizes the strategy and tactics underlying those mechanics. I think this is probably a little hard to understand, so let me jump into a few examples. In Age of Empires II, you begin with a scouting unit. There are several small decisions you need to make with this unit, like how much of your map to explore versus how much to scout your opponent. Another thing you can do is forego scouting entirely to lure one or more deer to your town center. The scouting itself also features some mechanical complexity because it's quite easy to lose your scout to your opponent's town center, so you kind of have to babysit the unit to use it effectively. Now you can think of these things as mechanics, things you physically need to do in order to use your scout effectively. But many of them also feature a subtle decision-making component. There's a trade-off in exploring your own map thoroughly versus sending your scout off to see if there's an early barracks or to see how many villagers your opponent has on gold. Luring deer can smooth out and power up your first Age, but it leaves you entirely blind to both your own map and your opponent's. Age of Empires II is filled with these kinds of micro-decisions, minor trade-offs and small mechanics that add up to a lot over time. If you compare this with Age of Empires III, you notice that many of these trade-offs were either rounded off or maybe even no longer exist. The maps are smaller, so it's easy to explore them in their entirety. Luring of hunts is done by villagers rather than explorers, and explorers themselves are relatively beefy and quite hard to kill. Now you can look at this in two ways. One is that there's less mechanical burden on players. Second is that the strategic depth to the game has been reduced. From my perspective, both of these things are true. You can look at virtually any mechanic from Age of Empires 2 and notice that layers of complexity have been removed in the transition to Age of Empires 3. Economic management is easier because there are no gather points, quick walling is no longer a thing, accuracy is a much less important mechanic, transitioning unit compositions is simpler because the 4th Age is less critical to closing out games, etc, etc, etc. One thing I want to mention here is that I'm not really arguing for or against either approach. Personally, I prefer the depth and mechanics of Age of Empires 2, but I also don't want to romanticize what that game is. Quick walling is probably the best example of how the game can be extraordinarily inaccessible to new players. The inaccuracy of ranged units prior to ballistics can also be quite frustrating. Age of Empires 3 smoothed out interactions like these ones and made the game a bit more accessible to newer players. From the quote above, you could argue this was an explicit design goal, so from that perspective you could even see this result as a success story. What I'm trying to say is that this is not exactly a critique, even if it might come across that way. It's actually a good jumping off point to a larger point I'd like to make about the structural changes Age of Empires 3 brought to competitive play. If you think about RTS in a very theoretical way, you can kind of categorize player investment into 3 categories: economy, military, and tech. Players have finite resources and can't simply get everything at once. As a result, wherever you invest your resources, by definition you can't invest them elsewhere. You're making a core commitment to a certain path down the tech tree. Spending money on either economy or military delays tech progression to the next age. Booming on 3 town centers restricts the food you have to produce more units or research technology. Teching rapidly to a strong unit composition leaves you with a smaller economy, etc, etc. Going further with this model, different games place different value on each of these 3 types of investments. Age of Empires 2 features elements of all 3. Different matchups and different maps call for different approaches. Age of Mythology emphasizes units and tech, but downplays the economic side of the game. It's generally impossible to go beyond 3 town centers. Age of Empires 3 goes further by additionally reducing the power and scope of massing military units. As a result, it's a very tech-focused game. The meta at all points of competitive play revolved around rapidly teching to specific, very strong unit compositions. I think I can explain my perspective here both theoretically and practically, and I think different people will find different arguments more or less convincing depending on how you think about these games. On paper, you can simply look at the mechanics of Age 3 and notice what they incentivize or don't incentivize. Strong early game defense, Minutemen, herdability of hunts, and powerful defensive shipments make early aggression less effective. This naturally encourages fast 3rd Age strategies. Units also scale poorly from one age to the next, giving an advantage to a tech player who rushes to a better unit comp. On the economic side, you simply didn't need that strong of an economy to construct a game-ending unit composition. That's not quite the same thing as saying that economy didn't matter. Both the Dutch and Japanese metas were driven in part by those races' powerful economies, but it was balanced differently. In Age of Empires 2, you frequently see games where one player techs and plays aggressively, while the other player booms economically. The booming player will be ahead if they can hold, but the tech player is difficult to stop. One TC play leaves room for earlier ballistics, an earlier siege workshop, more units, etc. Age of Empires 3 works differently because powerful tech units make it easy to quickly end the game. Falconets are a big part of this equation, but so too are the smaller map sizes. Aggression in both Age of Empires 2 and Age of Mythology is limited by your army's physical ability to cross the map. This is much less of a factor in Age 3. Another important but subtle factor is the use of stacked production on military buildings. You typically have much more production slack in Age 3 than you did in either of its 2 predecessors. This takes away some of the benefits of playing economically because you don't need to commit as much to production structures in order to field a large army. The result of all of these changes is a very tech-focused and fast-paced real-time strategy game. Players are incentivized to race toward the specific best tech and unit compositions, both because they're hard to punish and because they make it easy to end the game. There's just not much benefit to massing large numbers of weak units or investing a lot in your economy, so it just wasn't done very much, at least in 1 versus 1. The typical Age 3 game was a fast fortress with several engagements in the Third Age, followed by the game ending prior to either player reaching Industrial. I can already kind of expect a natural counterargument to this approach, which is to say that it's a bit too high-handed or theoretical of a way to approach the game. So from a practical perspective, let me just go through the various metas of competitive Age 3, from the launch of the game to the last major tournament in 2008. At launch, everyone played like it was Age of Empires II. That lasted for only a few weeks. Soon after, players discovered the power of Ottoman Abyss guns, and everyone raced to mass as many of them as possible. Over the course of meta shifts and balance patches, this moved to Spanish Lancers, German mercenaries, Sioux cav riders, Iroquois infantry, Dutch Reuters, and Japanese musketeers. On a very practical level, there was really no period in the competitive meta that didn't revolve around teching to a specific unit comp and doing game-ending damage with it. You could argue that this is just a matter of balance, and I think there's some merit to that argument. But there's something to the idea that every single meta centered on a superior tech unit. Compare this to the imbalance of the Egyptians in Age of Mythology. Yes, they tended to dominate the meta, but this was the result of a complex combination of economic advantages, early game defense, and powerful tech units. When you thought about the power of the Egyptians, your mind did not immediately go to one specific unit. It was a combination of many factors. This might come across as a little meta, but this retrospective itself was influenced by this state of affairs. One of the reasons I struggled for so long to complete this script was the sense that I simply wasn't covering everything. Why isn't there a section on trading posts, or native tribes, or the inclusion of a 5th age, or the changes to the counter system, or a discussion of how water combat had changed? And what I realized as I thought through it is that in the big picture, these features just didn't matter. I couldn't write anything about them because they were irrelevant in practice. The power and incentives around fast tech and aggression ended up overpowering many of the other gameplay features. Alrighty, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the dueling influences of Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft. From my perspective, any retrospective on this game has to consider the computer game's ecosystem that it was released in. Warcraft 3 is easier to understand. It was a direct competitor to Age of Mythology, and it was extraordinarily successful. The design of Age of Empires 3's first age is arguably a direct homage to Warcraft 3. Gone is the economic difficulties of Age of Empires 2, replaced by the creeping of treasures by your starting explorer unit. World of Warcraft is a more interesting one to think about because it's in a completely different genre. Developers at Ensemble played World of Warcraft heavily during the development of Age of Empires 3. It directly influenced the creation of the home city system and the use of an experience mechanic. I actually have a separate video dedicated to this topic, so if you're interested in my detailed thoughts on it, I'll put a link in the description of this video. For the purpose of this retrospective, I'd like to ask a more natural question. Why would a real-time strategy game borrow mechanics from a massively multiplayer online RPG? And this actually brings me back to a quote from the Age of Mythology developer commentary that I think provides important context on how the studio looked at the design of these games. We want Age of Mythology to be accessible to everyone, whether they're a gamer or not a gamer, no matter how much experience they have. The way I think about this is to view both Age of Mythology and Age of Empires 3 as trying to cast a wide net. Whereas earlier games like Age of Empires 2 focused on the core audience of RTS gamers, later titles emphasized expanding the audience and innovating on the gameplay to attract newer players from other genres. There's no denying that this was successful, at least to a certain extent. As I note in my Home City video, it's quite fun to progress a specific race, unlock cards, and build new decks. The question mark is whether the new players that were brought in outnumber the core players that felt marginalized by the shift in design focus. With the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to see that this was unfortunately not the case. As of this writing, the notoriously difficult Age of Empires 2 is about 10 times more popular than Age of Empires 3. I bring this up not to criticize AoE 3, but rather to just provide an honest retrospective on how I feel about this game. Age 3 was definitively the game that I was best at, traveling to many different locations and winning numerous tournaments. But it's also the game that I've least frequently gone back to in the following years. As someone who's played the Age series since Rise of Rome, I am part of that core audience of RTS players who like the depth and mechanics of the older games. Age 3 just didn't quite hit all of the notes that I expected it to as an Age game. And this is probably a fairly natural way to wrap up this retrospective. Age 3 was a great game that was successful in what it tried to do, but what it tried to do is not really what I wanted it to do. And that's probably the best way I can summarize how I look back on this game. Alrighty, thanks for tuning in, folks. Definitely let me know in the comments whether you prefer this new narration style or if you have any feedback on it. Like I mentioned earlier, it's kind of the result of time constraints, so I'm not exactly sure what I can change, but of course your feedback here is super helpful. Outside of that, I'd love it if you followed me on Twitter and Facebook, subscribed to me here on YouTube, and checked out my live streams over on Twitch. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.